A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to A Brush With, the podcast where I talk to artists about their influences from art to literature, film and music and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. And in this episode it's a brush with Ai Weiwei, an artist who in some ways needs no introduction. He's among the most famous artists in the world, principally due to the activism which led him to be incarcerated for months without charge in his native China in 2011. Since his release he hasn't let up and he continues to be a thorn in the Chinese government's side, relentlessly documenting and publicly speaking out against its attacks on freedom and manifold other human rights abuses. Weiwei was born in Beijing in 1957 and his father was the leading poet Ai Qing, once a comrade of Mao Zedong but later branded a rightist and interned with his family in labour camps, including one called Little Siberia in Xinjiang province, and forced to clean toilets. As Weiwei documents in his recent book 1000 Years of Joys and Sorrows, the activism that led to his own detention decades later was slow to emerge, but is part and parcel of his art and has been in earnest for the past 15 years. He cites as a particular turning point a work he made in 2007 for the influential exhibition Documenta, which happens every 5 years in Kassel in Germany. For Fairytale, as the work was called, he organised for 1,001 Chinese people to travel to Kassel for more than a month during the exhibition. It provoked all manner of interpretations about the isolation of Chinese culture from the world and the stereotyping of Chinese identity, about burgeoning globalisation and shifts in the movement of people, and about Fortress Europe and the continent's increasing anxieties about migrants and the other. Weiwei has written that in terms of its social engagement, Fairytale was a sign of things to come, and that his art has become increasingly preoccupied with what he calls the tangled connections between politics and reality. Another turning point happened the following year when the Sichuan earthquake caused the deaths of more than 5,000 school children, a tragedy covered up by the Chinese authorities and relentlessly exposed in art and activism by Weiwei ever since. Due to his blogging and social media activity, Weiwei gained increasing attention from the authorities, who set up CCTV cameras around his studio, one of the many potent modern objects he's since painstakingly made in marble as part of his work. That surveillance eventually led to his detention, and since then he's increasingly turned to documentary forms as his primary means of expression. A series of films reflect his recent campaigns. Cockroach addressed pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, Coronation explored the coronavirus lockdown in Wuhan, China, and Human Flow explored the global refugee crisis. Because of the notoriety of Weiwei's political activities, much of his work outside of activism is less well known. His artistic journey was slow. After Mao's death, as China began a cultural thaw, he was loosely affiliated to the countercultural art group Stars, but his artistic awakening really began in New York between the years 1981 and 1993. There he encountered the work of Warhol and Duchamp and began making his first forays into a conceptual but object-based practice. He lived briefly with the Taiwanese performance artist Teshinsei, while Sei performed Rope Piece, in which he was tied to the artist Linda Montano every day for a whole year. Though Weiwei had exhibitions in New York, he achieved little attention at the time. He made his money in various ways, from drawing caricatures of tourists to capturing protests and police brutality in Tompkins Square Park, one image of which appeared in the New York Times in 1988. It was only when he returned to China in 1993 that he began to build what became his mature language. He found that ancient and historic artefacts and furniture were widely available and began dramatically transforming them. He painted one with the Coca-Cola logo, had himself photographed while dropping another to the floor and smashing it, and covered others in pop art hued paint. He would take Ming and Qing era furniture, dismantle it and reassemble it into non-functional sculptural forms with the same precision and craftsmanship with which they were originally made. At the same time, he acted as a leader of the Chinese contemporary art scene, documenting it in 3 publications: the black cover book, white cover book and grey cover book. Objects crafted in fine materials and with loaded meanings continue to be a crucial part of Weiwei's work today. He's made everything from takeaway boxes and chopsticks to handcuffs in jade, and he's made blue and white porcelain decorated with images of global issues like migration and war. Perhaps his most famous sculpture work is Circle of Animals, Zodiac Heads, a group of 12 bronze animal heads reconstructing those looted from the Spring Palace in Beijing by the French and British colonial forces in the 19th century. That work was first shown in 2010 and is still touring the world today. For a decade or so after designing his own studio, he pursued a dual career as artist and architect through his architectural studio Fake. Eventually, he developed the design of Beijing's Bird Nest Stadium with the Swiss practice Herzog and de Meuron. But the architecture quickly faded as his activism took on greater significance. Though he rightly says that his political activities gained momentum in the mid-2000s as his anti-government blogging became the centre of his work, it had long been part of his practice. In parallel with those mid-1990s iconoclastic sculptures were a series of photographs. In one, he took a picture of his partner, Lu Qing, lifting up her skirt in front of the palace in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, the site of a massacre 5 years earlier. And a year later, he raised his own middle finger to the same building and took a photograph of it. This is the first work in his series study of perspective, which continued until 2017, with the gesture being repeated in front of a host of the world's tourist hotspots, including the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the St Mark's Basilica in Venice, and the Sydney Opera House. He said that study of perspective is not just an artwork, but a manifesto, and I began our conversation by asking him, what did he mean by that?
Well, I don't know, I said it's some artwork, but it definitely is a manifesto. The time I did it is 1995, around that time. What happens in Tiananmen Square is only 6 years apart, and that demonstrates to the world Chinese government have crashed down most peaceful demonstration in front of the whole world. Everybody watched it because CNN and other news outlet was there. So it's so much feelings when I, after 12 years, be apart from China, finally, I landed in Beijing and to see the last moment of my father. I have nothing to do in China. I feel no matter how China is struggling still, they never changed a bit in terms of a political and ideological argument. There would always be and still remains as an authoritarian state, which is not abstract words. They would always sacrifice the mind and the life of the whoever would make any kind of argument. So my silent pose to Tiananmen, which is the symbol of the nation, the new nation, but of course it's old, left over from Qing Dynasty, but still everybody think that is the symbolic architecture of China. So I give my left finger and take some kind of self-post image. That is very quiet, and that is only remind me I am here and I'm showing my attitude, my standing point, my position, my perspective to the current situation. So it is manifesto of an individual.
One of the things about the way that your work is often viewed is that it's entirely a response to China, but it's a response to the world, isn't it? Because you've replicated that gesture in many places, including in Venice, for instance, and elsewhere. So your attitude is a global reflection. It's not merely a gesture towards China itself.
By 1989, I think basically the Cold War is over. The Berlin Wall collapsed. And, the Soviet has to dismantled into different states, even the name changed. And with the victory of the Western world, I started to questioning myself what would be the ultimate conflicts in coming century, or what is the future alike. So somehow I predicted the ultimate struggle would be the state power and the individual, the collected power from the political sectors, business, economy, culture, and with the individual's freedom, the definition about being an individual. So under that kind of understanding, which I think was quite visionary on my side, and wherever I go, I start make this ridiculous image. And I call that theory called the study of perspective, which can be perspective of the Renaissance, when they start to learn how to do perspective, and it can be it's more political perspective.
Indeed.
So ended up I have hundreds of images in all kind of conditions.
I wanted to ask you about documentary because, of course, this has become a major strand in your work, but of course it was always a major strand in your work. There's the famous work that you made that got published in the New York Times in the 1980s that you took. And documentary has run through your work, and you said also that you see what's in front of you as a ready-made. And is that a sort of documentary impulse, do you think? It's about reality and documenting reality.
I think the question about documentary is about how an individual who would confront with so-called reality. And very often we are not ready, and most likely we are not in the position to interpret so-called the truth, or even just to document see it as a part of the facts, helping us to have a gazing in what's happening, and also to relook at it in the future. To relook at something in the future time is most important for human understanding, because it's like plant seeds to wait for its seeds to grow, but of course, that seeds will take a long time. Some insects would stay underground for 7 years or more to come out to the ground to finish the life cycle. And, in the nature, not everything is you can just grab it and to have a harvest, like in the supermarket. And today's life is very much has moral deficiency or problems, because seems everything is ready. And we are forgetting the process, the long time of hope or eager or prepared, or, for this lacking of this kind of immediate results. So our desire become very superficial and cheap, because we always trying to exclude the necessary time, location, and the difficulties. So documentary is most important for my study and for my mental possibility to adjust myself.
That's really interesting. And obviously you talk about difficulty there, and I know that you've said that things that come easy aren't worth doing. And it seems to me that underpins so much of what you do, whether it's creating the surveillance camera in marble and all those incredibly finely worked objects, but then also the sort of incredible effort that went into something like Fairytale. So the work always emerges almost from a struggle, would you say?
For myself, the simple measurement about the work, basically I have to see all the works. Doesn't matter what kind of idea I put in, it will end up meaningless. But what is meaningful is effort I try to structure, to follow my concept, and to meet all the difficult tasks, unthinkable, unpredictable situation. That not only give me the better understanding of the work, but also examines if my original concept works or not. So that's the total meaning of life.
In the Kettle's Yard exhibition, we're talking right now, you're sitting in Cambridge and the exhibition at Kettle's Yard opened a week or so ago from when we're talking. And in that show, you very directly confront fakeness and authenticity. And this has been an abiding concern of your career. Tell me what interests you most in that idea of authenticity and fake.
I grew up in ideological communist society. The purpose of life, being told, is trying to find the truth. And of course, we ended up become in a situation which is farthest from the truth. And, every line, every story, every historical memory has been either erased or converted into something else. So then I look at individual life or state propaganda, East or West, communist or capitalism. Then you can see what dominates us besides our sincerity and our fight for the truth. But what dominates is always misunderstanding or misleading or completely forced conclusion from a so-called truth. That's our reality. And it doesn't matter how much effort we are putting in. It seems that reality is still dominating. So I like to have a show to put so-called material facts, not truths, but facts. And with the one really can be identified by time, place, expert, and document as a true facts, and also something which so close to the truth, but possibly it's a copy. And also my effort in using the culture, political artifacts as ready-made to re-examine our human struggle.
Let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests now. Who was the first artist whose work you loved?
From time to time that it changes, but if you talk about the first artist had the effects on me, and then you talk about the visual artist, I guess, then I would say Marcel Duchamp, who is an artist or not so artist because he spent most of his time playing chess game or to enjoy his kind of bourgeois life. But still, he opens the door to a much broader view and to drag art once again into the intellectual practice, which art should always be.
Indeed. I'm really intrigued that in the book you said that you were so overwhelmed when you first saw Duchamp's work in Philadelphia that you didn't actually take note of his name. So he became almost a mythical figure for you almost immediately.
It's mystical, and still it's mystical to me, but sometimes you like the mystical to remain as mystical because we don't want to know when, the astronaut went to the moon to find the moon is just a piece of wasting land. We still want to see the moon through Tang Dynasty poetry. It's so beautiful. So the scientific research doesn't bring the human society into a better condition. That's a perfect example.
Tell me about Duchamp and the creation of that work, Hanging Man, which was a coat hanger you bent into the profile of Duchamp.
The work itself called homage to MD, That was at the moment I live in Brooklyn under the Williamsburg Bridge, and I was poor. Couldn't find how to pay the next month's rent. But at that time you always have a coat hanger when you move in any apartment in the drawer. So I played with it. I made his profile, and I enjoy that. That's probably the only effort which is worth to be mentioned in my 12 years of U.S. struggle.
Well, I don't know though, because also you did that piece which it seems to me is super powerful, which is the violin with the handle of the shovel, which seems it's very Duchampian in its own way, but it's twisting Duchamp in a new direction.
It's true. It's like my secret love, but that time U.S. is or the world is talk about German expressionists, which I have no interest in, and I don't like romanticism or expressionism in my life. I like rationality and humor and poetic and fine craftsmanship, and so I had a little show in Soho, and this little critique appeared on newspaper. The title is "Ai Weiwei's Heart Belongs to Dada." I feel so proud about myself. I mentioned that if Duchamp still knows this show would have a smile on his face. So I feel so satisfied, just by someone realize I'm an admirer of Duchamp's work.
In the book, you said that your father kept an album of images of works by Rodin deep in a drawer in your home. But it was interesting to me that you said that you had admired those in the album, but when you saw Rodin in the flesh in that same time that you saw the Duchamp, it left you cold. Tell me about that.
Yeah, my father have this little album of Rodin on deep drawer, hiding somewhere because it's all about nudity, sculpture of a love or case, or I was in my teens. I found that, and every time I would look at it, my face would turn hot and burning. You think about it in the communist society to see Rodin and crazy, and because with imagination you can burn yourself into ashes. But when I see the real sculpture, it's just cold piece of rock, and it's suddenly lost the possibility of imagination. So that is very much about religious belief. The belief itself is more important than the truth or fact, because it burns you from inside.
And tell me, which historical artist do you turn to the most today?
That's very hard to name it. I start to pay more attention to early Oriental art, because it's a very different perspective from the Western tradition, and they always associate humans' cultural interpretation with environment, nature, and that has certain beauty in there.
I'd like to know more about that moment when you returned to China in 1993. And you said that at that time, suddenly, antiques were very affordable and very visible. And you assembled this enormous collection in your yard, effectively, of them. And that began that process of reinterpreting. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, in the 90s, China started to develop. Everything goes. Everywhere is digging. Find tremendously amount of the underground objects are found, and they ended up in the market, people just selling it. And basically there's no regulation. So that time, easily you can spend a week to structure a museum, which can be the highest quality museum in most nations. It's just so much, everything, jade, bronze, furniture, anything. So fortunately, that's the moment I was drawn into that, and gave me a very intensive study of the past and how and why, and they make those kind of objects, and how style changes, what's new, what is past, how it relates to each other. That's a moment I still think that's historical. It cannot repeat itself. And it's almost like unreal.
And of course, there was the seminal work from that period is of you dropping the Han Dynasty urn. Tell me about the circumstances of making that work, because is it right that your brother took the photograph?
My brother with me, we go to the antique shops daily. I would pick up two types of works. One is, you call it standard. That means that reflects the common quality and the knowledge about a period, such as Han Dynasty vases. And another type is commonly not recognized, but I would think that's rare. In other words, because no definition, but certainly it come to from one period of time, bears important information. People cannot even name it. So that's two types of things I'm buying. But very often, the commonly accepted works such as Han Dynasty vases, I feel a little bit boring because it already belongs to some kind of intellectual property. And so one day I was joking with my brother because that time I'm not recognized as an artist, but rather no profession and hanging around. So I said, let's try this f3 camera, Nikon camera, to see if you can catch the image of that falling down. He said, really? I said, yes. He always enjoys my stupid acts. And yes, we tried the first one. He missed it. I can tell he missed it because, I have a strong experience with that. And but that time you cannot examine. It's not like today you have a digital, you can easily to see what is there. That time you have to take films. I said, let's make sure we got it. We have to do the second one. And the idea to do it is you take first photo. I'm not going to release it, but the most important is second photo once it's dropped to half before it's landed. So he gets the second one, the third one's easy. It's smashed. It's not going to move. So, yeah, but I didn't publish or even to think what to do with this kind of photo. Besides, it is kind of humorous act. Till many, many years later, I have an exhibition, almost 10 years later, I printed out because I was so shy then to write my professional career. Always have a 10 years gap. I cannot mention anything I did. No exhibitions, no any activities. So I would digging out some images can be demonstrated as I did something. So that's one of them. It's a bit shy about it because the same work with paint Coca-Cola on the Han Dynasty vases or middle finger. It's just so casual, so meaningless, and so childish. But ironically, it become my symbolically, they think that is identify me as an artist. How shameful, but history is always like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And also you sort of continue the mythology around the work, don't you, in a way? Because in the Kettle's Yard exhibition, there is a new presentation of that work, but realised in Lego. So can you tell me, why did you realise it in Lego? I was just curious about that choice of material.
I always try to destroy the understanding of the establishment. When people think that's iconic, I said, okay, let's play with Lego. So anybody can structure it with very different meaning. So that I think is successfully I did that, make it more childish.
Absolutely, but also it's about pixelation as well, it seemed to me. It looked like it when you're approaching it, it looks like a pixelated image, almost like an online image.
Yeah, the pixelized image is very much you can, if you want to resource it through art history, it belongs to Greeks and Romans with their mosaic works. I like it because with limited resource, Lego with very limited color, and which gave a image another possibility to show it in very different way. So it's the way to structure it as the pixelization is very much related to computer, internet, and the design world. So that opened up the whole door for me.
You mentioned historic furniture there, and quite early on when you began working with historic furniture, you, it seems to me, right from the start, knew that you wanted immaculate craftsmanship in these representations of the furniture. Why was it so important to you to achieve that extremely high quality?
This is interesting when we talk about so-called authenticity or real originality. In Chinese tradition, you always learn the past by copying it. To understand the profound knowledge about why they did that way. And so the best way to understand it is to dismantle it and to do study, and then you structure it, and maybe you use same method to make something contradiction to the original, but at the same time support the argument in the other way. So to have a doubt coexist with original is so important in human intelligent development. But that requires both so-called originality and the fake. Without one, the other will not exist.
A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the app for arts and culture. The app offers access to more than 60 cultural institutions through a single download. If you download Bloomberg Connects, you'll find a range of digital guides to venues where you can see art outside, including the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in northern England, one of numerous places where Weiwei has shown his monumental Circle of Animals Zodiac Head series, and the Socrates Sculpture Park in Long Island City, New York, where he took part in the group show Do It Outside. The app's guide to Socrates Sculpture Park offers a range of content relating to the park's present and past shows, digital features including conversations and performances, and an interview with Socrates' founder, the artist Mark Di Severo. To explore interactive guides to all the partnering institutions, download Bloomberg Connects today. The app's available from the App Store and Google Play, and you can keep up to date by following Bloomberg Connects on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I wanted to ask you about contemporary artists. Which contemporary artists do you most admire?
If I ask that question, very often I have to look at a mirror. It's true. It's my answer. I have to be honest. I have to think someone have complexity and still have this, can make a contradictory argument and always relate to aesthetic and philosophical argument. And might be a lot, but my knowledge is very limited. So I have enough fun to study myself.
I wanted to ask about Teshinsei, who you lived with in New York and actually witnessed this extraordinary performance that he did with Linda Montano, where they were tethered together. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that must have been such an extraordinary moment as a young artist to be surrounded by an artist who was engaged in this extraordinary durational performance, while you yourself were, in a way, in the very infancy of your artistic life.
Well, he's interesting, I would say, as a character, as a living person, but his practice is not unique if you turn to look at a Buddhist practice for lifetime with one belief or one act. To see life is, for art is a form of life itself, which in the Buddhist or some kind of religious practice is completely not just normal but necessary.
I wanted to also ask you about, in your black cover book, it's an extraordinary document of a particular moment in Chinese art. And so one of the curious things about you is there's a sort of generosity to a wider scene of Chinese artists at that time, but you've also sort of stood apart from them to a certain degree, operated it very much in your own way. Can you tell me about that relationship? Because you documented that scene very broadly in your black cover book and white cover book and grey cover book, but you also are separate from it.
Since I have experience in New York, which played a great potential of my later practice, and I have deep understanding about the temporariness of contemporary. So once I was in China, I always think I have to leave some kind of record for the future when they look back. Because people are eager to become successful or to grab something. And very often we lost the perspective, time, location, and how do you put it in the historical context. So I'm much better prepared for that. I'm never eager to show my work or to even to have a sense of myself, but rather to say, to provide a possibility for certain culture to grow, to provide that kind of temperature or environment. So I think that's much more important to hanging a painting on a white room or to appear in certain magazine. Both are not existing in China. So I made publications and made underground happenings just between a few artists and trying to encourage people go underground. And, that's a most meaningful time. And to realize how to make your work deeply just to serve your own self than to share it with public.
And also, of course, one of the things that you did as part of that process was that you documented Zhang Wan's 12 square meters performance, which of course also related to your father, which was there's this curious connection with your father's, being forced to clean lavatories.
Well, that generation young artists are really always asking my advice to give them some kind of, because I come back from New York, from the so-called East Village. So I always trying to tell them to pay attention to your own situation is most advantage you can do to yourself. Do not dreaming about New York or any place else. They should admire your condition and they should evaluate your work with absolute situation you have. So he dedicated that work to my father, and I probably 2 or 3 only person made the documentation for that work, and that eventually become his most notable work.
Indeed. What do you have around you in the studio? Do you have other artists' work on the walls around you or photographs?
I often look at my studio or my apartment in Beijing or in Berlin or now in Lisbon, Portugal. I would say if someone broke into my apartment, they would just immediately turn and say, this is wrong. It doesn't have a single work hanging there. I figured out, what's wrong with me, because every artist always have they never feel that the wall is not enough. They have 4 more works hanging in their location. I hate to look at my works. I don't like them that much. And I always looking for next work. And that give me some kind of initiate why I have to do it. And if there's work, it's only in between the process. And so I have to examine it. But once it's finished, I never hang in them. So it's no works.
Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
I only visit historical museums. And I was deeply impressed about historical museums in Egypt. And that's the last time I'm deeply impressed. But if I go to any location, I always find much more meaningful lessons or knowledge about the past.
One of the things I'm really interested in was that you wrote about MoMA. And when you wrote about MoMA, you talked about the effect that being in a museum collection can have on an artist, about that idea of being just banished to a storeroom or whatever. Tell me more about that.
someone come from a society, always have a criticism or self-criticism. That's how we raised up to look at the world with a very critical eye. That may not necessarily to be right, but critical habit or training is always there. So, of course, I have been very critical to the contemporary art, Western collections, so much self-indulgent and nonsense, and it's all because the commercial world and seems they have to have some hero rather than to have a meaningful argument. And so this kind of iconic type of thing is what modernism should destroy rather than to make a new temple to worship those kind of nonsense. So, yeah, that's basically my problem with those contemporary art museums. That put contemporary art far from reality and become less audience because they are so arrogant and so nonsense. It's just unbelievably how far our so-called this intellectual behavior are so disconnected with any intelligence and rationality.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
I'm not a very cultured man. I never had a good university study, and even high school is also not so. I cannot be proud of my reading experience or my learning, the knowledge. But still, I'm very keen about my treasure is sense of nowhere, doesn't belong to any these existing traditions, and always being seen as someone who questioning or doubt about my condition. It's not about others, rather by how to find a comfortable location to stand. And that seems not easy.
I wanted to ask you about what I think was a sort of life-changing cultural experience that you created for others, which is Fairytale in Castle at Documenta, which was this extraordinary endeavour where you brought over from China 1,001 Chinese people to Castle, to the centre of Documenta. Can you tell me more about that, and what were your intentions with that work?
I was coincidentally being introduced to Documenta even before I had a gallery, so my immediate response is, I'm not going to show you a painting or sculpture to this art community gathering, but rather to give some kind of suggestion which will remain as a question or as a fairy tale. So to challenge that, I decided to bring 1,000 Chinese to see Documenta and to select those people from online activity. At that time I was quite skillful and very attracted about the internet. So that only can be done in a very short time through internet. And of course, to bring 1,000 Chinese who has no art education, most of them are never being traveled, and they can never even dream to see an art show. What is art show? But rather, the understanding of art are completely different from a Chinese person than something like Documenta. They will never think that's an art show, but rather a half-constructed site. Or so for me, it's earlier imagination about globalization and the Chinese vastly become dominating, because that's long before that. And, that town, they haven't seen maybe 5 Chinese before. Now suddenly you see so many Chinese, but now, of course, in everywhere you can see Chinese. So many, because they are 1/6 of the world population. So it's a really nice project because nothing left. It's only the memory and the documentation of how those people made it possible to go to there.
talk about literature. Which writers or poets do you return to the most?
I miss the time I should spend time in literature. That time my father was cleaning the public toilet. I was helping him burn all his beautiful collections. But still have a chance to read some poetry. He collects the early poetry. But that's too early, like Whitman, Walter Whitman, or Mayakovsky, or Pablo Neruda, or Rimbaud, all those type of early 20th century poetry and literatures. But later, I don't have much time to read. And I appreciate reading. I like to buy books, but I have no time to read.
One really interesting thing about your work, I think, is that in a way, through blogging, through the existence of Twitter, you found a kind of means of writing in the way that your brother was a novelist. Obviously, your father was a hugely famous poet, but your form of writing really came into its own when you sat down in 2005 and wrote your first blog. What did that form of writing allow you to do that you hadn't had before, perhaps?
My writing has the character not being influenced by others, could be the only character, because I love writers, but only limited knowledge, like a Kafka's writing, or it's very limited knowledge about writing, or like a Mark Twain's writing, or all those kind. So people, as writers, they look at my blogs, they said, those writing, the writer cannot write that way. But that gives the character of my writing. So it's very plain, very direct. And it's always, I never really have something to decorate the idea, but rather to be plain nudity of the original meaning of a vocabulary. So I try to achieve that, but of course, it takes long time training and skill. And I'm still far from being a skillful writer. But that's always nice. You have a space and you can work on.
I wanted to ask about a work of yours that I saw that I found very moving, which was your father's chair, which you had made in marble. And it seemed to me to say so much about, the history of art is full of empty chairs, but it was a perfectly worked rendition of a very ordinary chair which he sat in. Could you say more about that?
I think the deepest emotion in our heart is something we cannot describe it. And that's why it remains there. Once we can clearly describe it, it will disappear. So many elements, I made it as a piece of art because I want to protect them from the rationality.
And so you did that with that piece because in a way it entombed an emotional response to your father.
It's true. I think something is emotional should remain as emotional rather than to use verbal to describe it. And like philosopher Wittgenstein said, the unspeakable sense should remain silent.
What music or other audio do you listen to while you're working?
I never listen to any music. That's sorry, I have to be frank. I never turn on any music. I admire people who love music, and every time once they listen to it, I can appreciate it. But it's just somehow in my brain or my heart, I cannot storage it. And believe me, I'm directing Puccini's Turandot. In 2 days, I'm flying back to Rome, continues the directing, and the May 20th will be opening for the Turandot. But I feel so bad. It's like I'm a crippled person, but I still selected as some kind of sport game. Of course, I will do all my effort to show how incapable.
But for instance, when you're working on Turandot, did you listen to the opera in terms of your preparation for that?
I have to listen to enormous times, and even this morning I was still listening to it. Of course, I can sense the emotion and the narrative and of the, how the music being structured. But For me, that's not a natural act. For me, silence is more natural and always winning.
What other media influence your work?
I work on anything, I can grab photography, videos, and anything.
I was intrigued by the fact that you said that a film by Eisenstein, October, had influenced that piece that you made with the chandelier and the scaffold. Can you say more about that?
Well, early memory leaves such an imprint in my later activities. It's like everything happened in the later presentation. Always somehow you can find traces in the early time, that proved we are not born as some kind of genius, but rather, we are born of the tragic. The mark has been put on us. Very often those marks are tragic marks.
And did you see Eisenstein's film in that period when you returned to China and Western films were sort of being shown in certain venues?
No, I see them when I was 21 years old, enrolled in a film institute. That time, China is still not open. There's no Western films, except in the film class, we have 2 Western films present every week. So, that's my first time see so many so-called modern classics.
If you could live with one work of art, what would it be?
That is very, very limited way to talk about, but how should I put it? Because I always think life itself is you live with yourself and to examine your own consciousness and your way of expression. But still, that is not just for you, but in relating to others. The communication is always need another one there. So you would not call it as art, which only benefits yourself. Even you have a strong belief is made for yourself, still the necessity to say you made that expression, and I think it's essential, but it's not enough. And if you make a pencil or make any mark on anything, can be on sand, on paper, or on piece of rock, that equally as important as so-called masterwork.
So lastly, what is art for?
Art is for self-conscious. Finally, is to realize who we are.
Weiwei, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ai Weiwei, The Liberty of Doubt, is at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, UK until the 19th of June. His show Intertwine is at the Serralves Museum in Porto, Portugal until the 9th of July. The opera Turandot is at the Rome Opera House from the 22nd until the 31st of March. And his book, 1,000 Years of Joys and Sorrows, is published by Bodley Head in the UK and priced £25 and by Crown in the US and priced $32. And that's it for this episode. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Do also subscribe to our other podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues every Friday. We're on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producers of the Art Newspaper podcasts are Julia Michalska, Amy Dawson and Henrietta Bentel. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway. And a big thank you to Ai Weiwei. That's it for this series. We'll see you soon. Bye for now. A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.